It happens every semester. The clock runs down, pencils drop, and months of complex learning are suddenly compressed into a single high-stakes final exam. For decades, educational management has operated under a critical misconception, treating the very concept of assessment as synonymous with a final numerical grade. Building a system exclusively around this endpoint pressure creates a severe structural vulnerability. This traditional paradigm is effectively a post-mortem. It meticulously measures exactly what a student failed to understand, at the precise moment it is too late for the teacher to actually fix it. Modern research, specifically the framework established by Lin and Gronlund, demands a different approach. They define true assessment as an integrated process of gathering information continuously, with the explicit goal of improving both teaching and learning in real time. To fix this, we have to completely dismantle the purely summative testing model and rebuild our educational architecture using a systemic four-dimensional framework. Right now, schools generate massive amounts of data and see minimal improvement in student outcomes. They treat evaluation as the final destination rather than what it should be, a navigational instrument. Any functional education system, no matter the scale, operates on a series of distinct, interconnected levels of planning and execution. To visualize this architecture, we start with Benjamin Bloom's classic triangular model of the educational process. At the top, we have educational objectives. These are the target destinations set by curriculum developers before anyone even steps into a classroom. Then we move down to learning experiences. This represents the actual pedagogical delivery, the day-to-day interactions, lectures, and activities that happen on the ground. Finally, we get learning evidence. This is the raw data generated by the students as a direct result of those experiences, their tests, projects, and daily work. Bloom's triangle effectively maps the downward flow of instruction, but it stops there. It lacks an explicit mechanism for quality control, meaning there is no built-in way to adjust the system if evidence shows students are failing. To close the loop, educational psychologist Norman E. Gronlund introduced a critical addition, a fourth dimension. He called this node value judgment, and it acts as the analytical engine of the entire system. Value judgment takes the raw learning evidence from the students and systematically analyzes it against those original educational objectives at the top. It forces educators to ask the hard questions and make a definitive ruling on whether the students have actually met the intended goals, or if the instruction fell short. Without the rigorous application of value judgment, collecting learning evidence is merely an administrative chore. It generates noise, but it does not drive systemic improvement. Applying Gronlund's value judgment effectively depends entirely on how managers define the student's operational role during an assessment. To do this, we break assessment down into three distinct paradigms. These are defined entirely by when they happen and what they focus on. The first is assessment of learning, or AOL. This is the traditional summative model we are all used to. AOL occurs strictly after the learning period has concluded, and its focus is entirely on measuring final results. In this paradigm, the student is relegated to the role of a passive recipient of judgment. The exam happens to them, and a grade is delivered. The second paradigm is assessment for learning, or AFL. This is the formative model, designed specifically to intervene before a student reaches the point of failure. AFL occurs during the learning process. It focuses on how the student is working through the material, giving teachers the data they need to make on-the-fly instructional adjustments. Because of this real-time interaction, AFL requires the student to be an active participant in generating their own learning data. Finally, we have the most advanced paradigm, assessment as learning, or AAL. AAL happens continuously throughout the entire educational experience, shifting the focus inward toward deep reflection. The ultimate goal here is to elevate the student into a self-assessor, someone who can independently monitor and evaluate their own cognition and understanding. A modern, effective educational curriculum cannot rely on AOL alone. To actually teach, rather than just filter, the system must actively design structures that support continuous formative and metacognitive practices. The implementation hurdle here is practical. Educators often struggle to generate actionable formative and metacognitive data in the middle of a chaotic, real-time classroom. This struggle usually stems from a pervasive operational error. confusing the method of assessment with the physical instrument used to measure it. We need to draw a hard line between the two. Techniques are strictly the active processes or methods used to extract information from students. These are the interactions that drive formative assessment, like direct classroom observation, targeted questioning, role-playing exercises, or peer reviews. Tools, on the other hand, are the specific designed instruments used to capture, measure, or quantify the data generated by those techniques. This is where we systematically recapture the evidence, using instruments like structured rubrics, long-term portfolios, rating scales, and reflective journals. The two must work in tandem. A technique like a peer review generates the interaction, but you need a tool like a rubric to actually capture the value of that interaction. Pairing the wrong tool with a technique corrupts the learning evidence. It spits out bad data and sabotages Gronlin's value judgment before the analysis can even begin. Which brings us back to the fatal flaw of treating assessment purely as a numerical end state. As outlined by the National Academy for Educational Management, evaluation is not a final destination. It is a continuous, interlocking feedback mechanism. Shifting a curriculum toward formative structures puts these gears into motion, generating a real-time stream of evidence of student comprehension. Aligning techniques and tools to capture granular evidence turns the assessment process into a continuous audit of the curriculum itself. Analyzing this constant stream of learning evidence is what allows educators to pinpoint systemic weaknesses and adjust their instructional strategies on the fly. Ultimately, this rigorous evaluative architecture encourages reflective practice and guarantees systemic teaching effectiveness by making learning visible at every stage of the process.